It's Friday, the 20th of January, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh and Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary reporter David Cornock. On the programme this week.
It is vital that the Metropolitan Police and other forces double down on their efforts to root out corrupt officers. This may mean more shocking cases come to light in the short term.
The Home Secretary tells Parliament how she intends to tackle police criminality and misconduct. As more ambulance strikes are announced for February, Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer clash at PMQs over waiting times.
If he won't answer any questions, will he at least apologise for the lethal chaos under his watch?
As we've seen this week, the honourable gentleman will just say anything if the politics suits him.
Fury from the Scottish National Party as the UK government decides to block a new law, making it easier for Scots to choose their legal sex.
Will she commit to respecting the court's decision regardless of any outcome?
Perhaps the member should have respected the outcome of this Parliament, and the UK government should have respected the outcome of this Parliament.
And tech bosses could face jail for failing to protect children online.
For far too long, the platforms and providers have got away with zero regulation, nothing whatsoever, and enough is enough.
Let's start here in Westminster. David, this week brought the news that a Metropolitan police officer had admitted to dozens of rapes and sexual offences against women. It's the latest in a growing list of scandals involving the police, and the Home Secretary obviously made a statement to Parliament. What did she say?
Yes, Joe, another jaw-dropping scandal, really, and more questions for the Met over a long-serving police officer, David Carrick. It also emerged that more than 1,000 cases of domestic and sexual abuse are being investigated by the Met against their own officers. Now, it's fair to say the government response did come in instalments. On Wednesday, we had Rishi Sunak saying that every force in England and Wales, all 43 of them, would be required to carry out checks against databases, against all their serving officers and their staff. And a day earlier, the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, had come to the Commons, really, and when she gave that statement, she did face a lot of questions and a lot of pressure to go further and introduce domestic laws, new laws, to tackle problems with police misconduct.
Yesterday was a dark day for British policing and the Metropolitan Police, as an officer admitted being responsible for a monstrous campaign of abuse. Mr. Speaker, I am sure the whole House will want to join me in expressing my sympathy to the victims and thank them for their courage in coming forward. For anyone to have gone through such torment is harrowing, but for it to have happened at the hands of someone they entrusted to keep people safe is almost beyond comprehension. It is vital that the Metropolitan Police and other forces double down on their efforts to root out corrupt officers. This may mean more shocking cases come to light in the short term. It's now for the Metropolitan Police to demonstrate that they have an effective plan in place to rapidly improve their vetting processes.
There are still no legal requirements on vetting. Forces can effectively do what they want. They don't even have to check employment history and character references, and some don't. They don't even have to interview people beforehand. And some of the things that police forces have been doing to tackle misogyny or to increase diversity, to improve their response to communities and to crime, the Home Secretary has dismissed as woke, even though they are about tackling some of the most serious crimes.
Well, here we are again. It feels like Groundhog Day. I'm here questioning one of our ministers in a government that I support about culture within the Metropolitan Police Service. What is going to change? When are we really going to fully use statutory power to protect women from male violence?
We've already commissioned the Angelini inquiries. We must let those run their course. And on the basis of those robust findings, we'll be able to take the right action to ensure that this kind of behaviour is rooted out, that these kind of individuals are not allowed into the police force in the first place, and that we can better protect the public and install confidence amongst the public when it comes to policing.
As honourable members have said, and as has been recognised and complained about by successive Metropolitan Commissioners, what they say is that the regulations that this House has put in place in statutory instruments prevent them sacking officers who they know are unfit to be in the Metropolitan Police. So that puts a responsibility on us to change those regulations.
I'm just exhausted about the number of times in this House we have to talk about this issue. Because women in Lancashire have seen what's happened and what's been in the newspapers about David Carrick, and they saw about Wayne Couzens, and they've seen about so many other cases, Home Secretary. And they want to know why there is no legal requirement for vetting when officers move between forces. So yes, we're talking about the Met today, but we could equally be talking about Lancashire Constabulary. So Home Secretary, I'd like to know what plans are in place to legally require vetting when officers move between forces to stop these perpetrators moving around the country to avoid justice.
We will take further action to look at the disciplinary process, and the reports which are currently running their course need to conclude, so we have an evidence base to take the appropriate action in legislation if necessary.
That was the Home Secretary. Now, there was another big issue this week, a constitutional one. The news that the government is going to block Scotland's bill allowing people to choose their legal sex more easily. And it caused a lot of upset and a row, really, in the Commons, didn't it?
It certainly did. Now, we sometimes overuse, I think, the word constitutional crisis to describe any argument between Westminster and Holyrood. But this is the very first time in almost a quarter of a century of devolution that the UK government has used its veto to block a law coming from the Scottish Parliament. And now the idea behind this from the Scottish government and approved by the Scottish Parliament is to make it easier to change your legal sex and remove the element of medical diagnosis, and also bring the age at which you can begin that process down from 18 to 16. Now, the UK government says that's going to conflict with the Equality Act, which applies throughout the UK, and that's why it's determined to veto the bill. Now, the row is likely to end up in court. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. But in the Commons, certainly, there were some very passionate speeches and arguments about some very emotive and divisive issues.
I have not taken this decision lightly. The government has looked closely at the potential impact of the bill, and I've considered all relevant policy and operational implications together with the Minister for Women and Equalities. And it is our assessment that the bill would have a serious adverse impact, among other things, on the operation of the Equality Act 2010. Those adverse effects include impacts on the operation of single-sex clubs, associations and schools, and protections such as equal pay. The government shares the concerns of many members of the public and civic society groups regarding the potential impact of the bill on women and girls. The Section 35 power was included in the Scotland Act, which established the Scottish Parliament. This is the first time the power has been exercised, and I acknowledge that this is a significant decision.
It appears to me that this has only become a last resort in terms of the legal timing, because both governments can't and won't work with each other. In this case, it's the public who are let down. Trans people who suffer intense discrimination will now not see this legislation take effect anytime soon, if at all, and women's rights groups who will likely not see their concerns addressed or their fears alleviated, because this simple truth is that this has turned into a constitutional bun fight.
I welcome the government's invoking of Section 35 in this case, as the bill clearly conflicts with the Equality Act and would have repercussions for women across the UK. Does the Secretary of State recognise the strength of feeling amongst women, women's rights groups and activists in Scotland that this bill seeks to allow anyone at all to legally self-identify as either sex and therefore enter all spaces, including those necessarily segregated by sex, such as domestic violence settings, changing rooms and prisons.
I think the honourable lady deserves a lot of respect for her courage in standing up on this issue. And I think when the statement of reasons is read later today, she will be proved to be absolutely right in the things she's saying.
This dispute has been confected by the SNP in pursuit of their separatist agenda. So does my right honourable friend agree that it really is shameful that they have weaponised vulnerable children in pursuit of that agenda and would impose that agenda on the majority of children across the whole of the United Kingdom?
Yes.
What the Secretary of State has just done is ignored the fact that parties that voted for this in the Scottish Parliament had a manifesto commitment. It has the majority support of the Scottish Parliament, and it absolutely demonstrates to everybody in Scotland that if you want to protect your Parliament, if you want to protect the rights of the Scottish Parliament to legislate and devolve matters, then we have to take away the threat of action from the Secretary of State. And the only way, Mr Deputy Speaker, that we protect our Parliament is by Scotland becoming independent.
Mr Speaker, I've just won a £10 note.
I notice that the Secretary of State fails to mention that this is the most consulted piece of legislation that has ever gone through the Scottish Parliament. So this idea that it is being rushed is nothing more than a lie.
This Tory government make me sick to my stomach. And if this Secretary of State is going to come to this House and trample all over trans rights, over Scottish democracy and over equality, he should at the very least do his homework, because he clearly knows as little about this bill as he does about devolution.
The Secretary of State for Scotland knows the value in which I hold the Union, so I'm sure he will understand how difficult this is for me. But as a Scottish woman, the mother of a Scottish daughter, someone who has campaigned and continues to campaign and work for women's safety, I have heard the concerns. And I have looked at every clause and amendment of this bill, spoken with MSP colleagues from all parties, in the search for where it undermines the Equalities Act and the protections in single-sex spaces and others that it offers me and every other woman that I know. I can't find it.
Exactly. I sincerely hope, and I do say this, Mr Speaker, in all sincerity to the Secretary of State, I hope that he will reflect upon the damage that he seeks to do to his own union in this regard, that he vault-faces, that he shows that he does respect Scotland's democracy and that he allows this legislation to pass as it should.
Now, we're going to stick with this subject. David, will come back to you later on in the programme, because the political week in Scotland has been dominated by the government's decision. As you heard there from David, it's the first time it's tried to block a bill using its veto in almost a quarter of a century of devolution. Let's go to Edinburgh now and speak to our Scotland political correspondent, Andrew Kerr. Andrew.
Yes, Joe, it really has been quite a week in Scottish politics, hasn't it, with that issue? We began the week talking about that issue, and therefore we end it as well with the UK government deciding to use what has been termed the nuclear option in blocking the bill. Now, of course, it was passed here at Holyrood just before Christmas, and as we've been hearing, it makes it easier to change your legally recognised sex. As we heard from the House, their opponents are concerned about the potential impact on women's safety. And as we heard from the Secretary of State for Scotland, UK ministers are worried about the potential adverse impact on UK-wide equalities legislation. So as the Scottish Secretary was moving that Section 35 order in the House of Commons, there were questions here at Holyrood, with Labour joining in the criticism.
The Secretary of State may hide behind legal advice, but the truth is the Tories at Westminster have proven that they are no friends to trans people, and as the architects of the rape clause, we know they are no friends to women and girls. So does...
Thank you.
So does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that this is a cynical and dangerous power move by an out-of-control UK government that is determined to wreck this bill at any cost?
I think the truth is, Presiding Officer, that whether or not the Parliament had passed this legislation in December or this month or February, I fear we would have always ended up here with a Section 35 order, because the UK Tory government does not like this bill, does not want this bill, and will do everything to block this bill.
Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, if this situation does end up in court, will she commit to respecting the court's decision regardless of any outcome?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, perhaps the member should have respected the outcome of this Parliament, and the UK government should have respected the outcome of this Parliament. That's where respect starts. But we will vigorously defend the legislation in our democratic process. Of course we would. It would be a democratic outrage not to.
Now, Joe, the political impact of this can't be underestimated. Of course, some people say this issue is part of the so-called culture wars. You mix that in with the Scottish constitutional question and you have a very heady mix, of course. So as you have the SNP and the Conservatives arguing, it's also very tricky for Labour. They appear to have different views on this topic in London and in Edinburgh. Monica Lennon, whom we heard from there, has said that Sir Keir Starmer's comments on this issue have been ill-informed and unhelpful. But we've also heard from the Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland this week, the Labour MP Ian Murray. He said that Miss Lennon should stop slagging off Sir Keir.
Yes, as you say, an emotive issue and divisive at the same time for the political parties involved. Now, the gender bill featured only in passing, it seems, at First Minister's questions, with the Conservative leader in Scotland, Douglas Ross, picking up instead on teacher strikes. What did he say?
Yes, there has been so much heat on that topic, but perhaps the Conservatives didn't want to alight on it today. Perhaps they wanted to move on to something else. Nicola Sturgeon briefly mentioned it. She was saying Douglas Ross favours riding roughshod over democratically elected institutions. However, it has been a week of hearing about industrial action and the UK government's anti-strike legislation. So Douglas Ross questioned the First Minister about a series of teacher strikes that we're seeing in Scotland at the moment, and he was tying that in with the government's record on education.
Nicola Sturgeon said, "Judge me on education." Well, the Education Secretary has done exactly that and found that the First Minister makes promises her government won't meet. Her failures have left teachers frustrated, disappointed and angry. Today, schools in North Lanarkshire and Moray are on strike. Tomorrow, it's Angus and Eastern Bartonshire. Next week, schools in another 10 council areas go on strike, including here in Edinburgh. The following week, another 10 are striking from Borders to Aberdeenshire. After years of disrupted education because of the COVID pandemic, when the Scottish Government was too quick to shut down schools and limit teaching time, pupils are once again getting a raw deal.
In terms of pay dispute with teachers, this is a government that continues to negotiate and to seek settlement. Again, that stands in marked contrast to where the Conservatives are in power, where the Education Secretary in England said this week that we didn't negotiate pay with teachers because that is not what the government is here to do. The Tories, of course, are trying to take away the right to strike of public sector workers. We will continue to seek fair pay deals in the NHS, in the teaching profession and elsewhere across our public sector.
Well, we have been seeing a significant amount of industrial action in Scottish schools. Councils are facing budget pressures too, of course. Now, the original question was predicated on one report claiming that Glasgow City Council were going to cut 800 teachers. That's 15% of their workforce. Nicola Sturgeon sought to downplay that in the chamber here. She was saying she would prefer to have more teachers and not fewer.
Well, let's go from schools and teachers to the NHS in Scotland. It's been another significant issue at Holyrood this week. Labour have picked up on a number of points. What were their concerns?
Yes, of course, health has dominated this winter debate here in Holyrood. Of course, the First Minister has been going back to her podium on Mondays. That was the briefing room used for COVID to update us on the state of the health service because things have been quite bad. Labour have spent the past 12 weeks at First Minister's questions picking up on this issue, putting their views across. Now, their leader spoke about social care pressures this week, and the party also used their opposition debating time this week as well to pick up on NHS issues after holding a round-table debate with medics.
We heard directly from them about the impact that this crisis is having. They told us in their words that this is causing them moral injury because they feel unsupported in their work. One frontline worker said the conditions they were working in meant no dignity, no respect, no safety for patients. And they also told us that this crisis in our NHS is not because of COVID, it's not because of flu, it's not strep A, it's not winter pressures, it's the result of 15 years of SNP failure. The staff on the front line know best how to restore our NHS, how to save lives and modernise the system for the future. But this SNP government is not interested in listening. The government's amendment today says it all. Excuse after excuse is not our fault, no solutions. What a pitiful dereliction of duty.
Cabinet Secretary. I thank Jackie Bailey for giving way. I wonder if she would listen to the head of the Scottish, the GP Council here in Scotland, in terms of the BMA's Scottish GP Council. And Dr Andrew Buist said, I was not at all convinced by Keir Starmer, his ideas behind reform. They seem very marginal and following on from West Streeting's naive comments on GP reform. I think further work is required from Labour. Isn't this a demonstration that on any subject, but particularly health, that Labour is completely out of ideas?
Jackie
Bailey, who is wrong, the BMA or Scottish Labour?
So, of course, health has dominated debate up till now, Joe, but expect much, much more on that gender reform round.
Andrew Kerr there at Holyrood, thank you very much. Our parliamentary reporter David Cornock is still with me. David, tell us what topics came up at Prime Minister's questions this week.
Joe, we heard from Stephen Flynn, the SNP's new Westminster leader, earlier, and you won't be surprised to learn that he used his questions to Rishi Sunak to raise that gender recognition row. As for the other exchanges, well, they were dominated largely by delays in waiting for ambulances, with Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer arguing over who was to blame.
Mr. Speaker, it's 3 minutes past 12. If somebody phones 999 now because they have chest pains and fear it might be a heart attack, when would the Prime Minister expect an ambulance to arrive?
Mr. Speaker, it's absolutely right that people can rely on the emergency services when they need them, and that's why we're rapidly implementing measures to improve the delivery of ambulance times and indeed urgent and emergency care. But I'd say to the honourable gentleman, if he cares about ensuring that patients get access to life-saving emergency care when they need it, why won't he support our minimum safety legislation?
Mr. Speaker, he obviously doesn't know or doesn't care. I'll tell him. If our heart attack victim had called for an ambulance in Peterborough at 12:03, it wouldn't arrive until 2. These are our constituents waiting for ambulances I'm talking about. If they were in Northampton, it wouldn't arrive until 2. If they were in Plymouth, it wouldn't arrive until 3. That's why someone who fears a heart attack waiting more than 2.5 hours for an ambulance. Not the worst-case scenario, just the average wait. So for 1 week, will he stop blaming others, take some responsibility, and just admit, under his watch, the NHS is in crisis, isn't it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I noticed the one place the honourable gentleman didn't mention was Wales, where we know ambulance times are even worse than they are in England, Mr. Speaker. No, and the reason that is the case, because this is not about politics. This is about the fact that the NHS in Scotland, in Wales, in England, is dealing with unprecedented challenges, recovering from COVID, dealing with a very virulent and early flu season, and everyone is doing their best to bring those wait times down.
Mr. Speaker, over the 40 minutes or so that these sessions tend to last, 700 people will call an ambulance. 2 will be reporting a heart attack. 4 will be reporting a stroke. But instead of the rapid help they need, many will wait and wait and wait. So if he won't answer any questions, will he at least apologise for the lethal chaos under his watch?
As we've seen this week, the honourable gentleman will just say anything if the politics suits him. It's as simple as that. He will break promises left, right and centre. He promised to nationalise public services. He promised to have a second referendum. He promised to defend the mass migration of the EU. If we are going to deliver for the British people, people need to have strong convictions. But when it comes to the honourable gentleman, he isn't just for the free movement of people, he's also got the free movement of principles.
To promise is a thing, to keep it is another. Well, the Scottish Government kept their manifesto promise to the people, and thanks to support from members of all political parties in Holyrood, the GRR bill was passed. Surely in that context, the Prime Minister must recognise that it is a dangerous moment for devolution when both he and indeed the Leader of the Opposition seek to overturn a promise made between Scotland's politicians and Scotland's people.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me be crystal clear that the decision in this case is centred on the legislation's consequences for reserved matters. This bill would have a significant adverse effect on UK-wide equalities matters, and so the Scottish Secretary, with regret, has rightly acted.
Mr. Speaker, let me be crystal clear. This is the Conservative Party seeking to stoke a culture war against some of the most marginalised people in society, and Scotland's democracy is simply collateral damage. Are we not now on a slippery slope from devolution to direct rule?
No, Mr. Speaker, of course we're not. This is simply about protecting UK-wide legislation, about ensuring the safety of women and children. This is not about the devolution settlement. I would urge the honourable gentleman and his party to consider engaging with the UK government on this bill, as we did before the legislation passed, so that we can find a constructive way forward in the interest of the people of Scotland and the United Kingdom.
So they were the arguments at Prime Minister's questions. Meanwhile, the wave of strikes continue. Nurses walked out this week, and teachers in England have also voted for industrial action across a number of dates. More strikes are scheduled in the ambulance service. Has the government got a plan to deal with all this strife?
At the moment, Joe, ministers do seem to be digging in. We had the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, warning this week that what the unions want would actually mean taking money from frontline care, from the health service. So that argument is still going on, despite indications that there is some public support, particularly for nurses. Now, long term, the government has another plan, and we did hear the odd reference to it there, and that is they want to change the law to make it to reduce the impact of strikes on public services. So this would mean that workers in, for example, health service, fire and rescue, would be required to provide a minimum service level when strikes are happening, or they would risk sanctions, could lose their jobs. Now, the strikes bill did clear its first parliamentary hurdle this week, so it's been sort of initially approved by MPs. Lots of arguments over the detail, and the debate, it was one of those where MPs did divide, you won't be surprised to learn, very much along party lines.
This government firmly believes the ability to strike is an important element of industrial relations in the UK. It's rightly protected by law, and we understand that an element of disruption is likely with any strike. But we also need to maintain a reasonable balance between the ability of workers to strike with the rights of the public, who work hard and expect the essential services they pay for to be there when they need them. There comes a time when we can't let this continue, and that is why we need minimum safety and service levels, Madam Deputy Speakers, to keep livelihoods and lives safe And it's frankly irresponsible, even surprising, for the opposition opposite to suggest otherwise.
The reality is that safe agreements are negotiated between the staff and the employers. Exactly. The reality happens on the ground, so the process and the outcomes protects the NHS, because that's what staff want to do. So will he ensure that he reflects the truth of what happens in the NHS?
Well, look, I just would say to the honourable lady, who I know has received money from GMB, RMT, Unite the Union, CLP, amongst others, nothing wrong with that. I'm just putting it on the record to simply say she is wrong factually about the way that the last 2 strikes have occurred.
I regret at the start, Madam Deputy Speaker, the tone of the Secretary of State's response today, because to suggest or imply in any way that members of this House do not care about their constituents and put their constituents first, and that members of our vital public services that got us through the pandemic in some way do not take the safety of their people who they look after seriously and walk away. I think the Secretary of State should reflect on his comments today. This legislation is as empty of detail as it is full of holes. So we will oppose the sacking of nurses bill, and not just nurses, Madam Deputy Speaker, but also many of the key workers who we clapped and who kept our services going in the face of the pandemic. And we will vote against it tonight. And the next Labour government will repeal it.
Would the honourable lady be able to tell us what level of pay she thinks and the Labour front bench believe is appropriate? Would this be in line with inflation? Would this be more than inflation? And how exactly would Labour solve this dispute?
Well, I'll just educate the honourable member that whilst I used to be a trade union official and I'm a member of a trade union, I don't actually negotiate on behalf of the trade union. But what I would do is I would sit round the table and resolve this dispute with the trade unions, and that would be better than what the Conservatives have done.
Labour's Deputy Leader Angela Rayner there. Thank you very much for now, David. Let's go to Cardiff and talk to our correspondent there, Kemlyn Davis. Hello to you, Kemlyn. The state of the health service wasn't just debated in Westminster, but also in the Senate this week. What happened?
Yes, that's right. And in light of all the recent pressures on the Welsh NHS, the numerous stories of people not being able to get an ambulance or facing long waits in A&E, the pay disputes and so on, Plaid Cymru called on the Welsh Labour government to acknowledge and declare that there is a health crisis in Wales.
The Oxford Dictionary, often a go-to, suggests for crisis a time of great danger, difficulty or doubt when problems must be solved or important decisions must be made. Now, I don't think there could be a better definition of where we are regarding health and care in Wales.
When you say declaring a health crisis in Wales, they are serious words that you've got to think carefully about before stating them. I'm talking about mismanagement. Serious words. But that is exactly the position we're in. And for the reasons why Rhian ap Iorwerth has outlined, you've got to recognise a problem in order to be able to move forward.
They are doing their best, but know that the NHS they have always been proud to work for cannot currently do its best for patients. And every time they hear a minister say there isn't a crisis, they ask, if this isn't a crisis, then how much worse are they expecting it to get?
Yes, this is a system under strain, but the NHS is dealing with around 2 million contacts every month. Every month. So yes, there are parts that are under strain, but let's not pretend that the whole system is in crisis.
Eluned Morgan there. Well, yesterday, the latest Welsh NHS performance stats were published with a number of unwanted records being set once again for December in relation to ambulance response times, handover delays and A&E waiting times. In response to those figures, the Welsh Government said that the pressure on the system would have been even greater had it not been for the improvements that the Government says it's been making.
Cemlyn, the Scottish Government's constitutional clash with the UK Government, which we've discussed earlier on in the programme, also came up in the Welsh Parliament this week. What did the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, have to say about it?
Yes, that's right. It was raised here during First Minister's questions by Plaid Cymru's leader, Adam Price, because he's worried about the possible implications for Welsh devolution in the future. So he asked the First Minister about this on Tuesday.
Do you agree with me that this sets a very dangerous precedent, not only in terms of your own government's aspirations, which we share, to bring forward similar legislation here, but also in terms of devolution more generally, and the use of, in our case, the Section 114, I believe, in the Government of Wales Act?
I think the UK government's decision to use powers that have never been used in the whole history of devolution is a very dangerous moment. And I agree with the First Minister of Scotland that this could be a very slippery slope indeed.
Yes, so Mark Drakeford's concern is that this unprecedented move by the UK government could be repeated in the future, undermining the Senedd here and devolution more broadly. Now, he also suggested that his government would be prepared to support the Scottish government if this row ends up in the Supreme Court, as we would expect it to.
Yes, I'm sure that events between the Scottish Government and the UK Government will be watched very closely in the Senedd. I mean, the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, also faced questions on an entirely different subject, Cemlyn, about the future of Cardiff Airport. Why was that?
Yes, that's right. The airport, which is owned by the Welsh Government, suffered another blow last week when the budget airline Wizz Air pulled out of the airport, leaving many passengers who had flights booked in limbo. The company said it had taken that decision because of the current economic climate. Then earlier this week, the former boss of BMI said that no airline would invest in Cardiff Airport because of its coastal location. And earlier this week, during First Minister's questions, the leader of the Welsh Conservatives group here, Andrew Davies, raised his concerns about the airport with the First Minister as well.
The airport, sadly, has fewer passengers now than it has had for a very long time. Yes, COVID intervened to obviously affect all airports, but if you take Bristol Airport, it has seen a 22% decline in its passenger numbers, but still handles close to 7 million passengers. If you take Birmingham Airport, another competitor, they have seen a 33% decline and still handle 8.5 million passengers. It is a fact that no airport that I can find has had such a generosity of government money made available to it, £250 million, and had such poor outcomes achieved.
The Welsh Conservative Party has never supported the airport, has always done its best to talk down its chances of success. They never like to face up to their own responsibilities. So if time after time after time on the floor of the Senedd, I have heard Conservative spokespeople here complain about the airport, suggest it shouldn't have been taken into public ownership, and generally undermine the airport's prospects of success.
Well, the First Minister added that the airport had been on the right trajectory before the pandemic struck, and he said that a rescue and recovery plan is in place to make the airport self-sustainable and profitable for the future.
Thank you, Cemlyn. Cemlyn Davies there at the Senedd in Cardiff. Let's return to Westminster, David, because tougher penalties have been added to a long-running government bill designed to protect children from harm when they go online, commonly known as the Online Safety Bill or Online Harms Bill. Now, the bosses of tech companies could now be sent to prison for failing to prevent online harm to children. How did that change actually come about?
Well, the bill certainly is long-running. It's 10 months since it was introduced into the Commons. MPs approved it this week, but it is vastly changed, and there will be further changes to come as well when it goes to the House of Lords. And the reason for that, as you've said, is that the government has now accepted that it should be changed so that the bosses of tech companies who fail to do their duty in terms of protecting children online could go to jail. We are still waiting for the detail, but this U-turn has come about, as so many under Rishi Sunak, really, because of the weight of Conservative opposition. Around 50 Conservative MPs lined up to propose this. The government did the maths and realised it was going to lose the vote. So when this bill continues its parliamentary journey, there will be further changes to it. Ministers have promised to introduce a similar amendment to the one proposed by the rebels. Let's have a look at how the debate unfolded.
For far too long, the platforms and providers have got away with zero regulation, nothing whatsoever, and enough is enough. Madam Deputy Speaker, during the last report stage, I made clear that Labour considers individual liability as central to ensuring online safety is taken seriously by online platforms. We have been calling for stronger criminal sanctions for months, and while we welcome some movement on this issue from the government today, ultimately the enforcement is now over a narrower set of measures after the government gutted much of the bill before Christmas. This last-minute U-turn is another one to add to the long list. But to be frank, Madam Deputy Speaker, very little surprises me when it comes to this government's approach to lawmaking.
Children and vulnerable people have been felled by tech companies and regulation. And of course, this is where we have that duty to step up. We have that responsibility to tighten the law, protect children from online harms, exploitation and inappropriate content.
I have to talk a little bit about the Jewish community. I think the hope that the online safety bill would give us some respite from the torrent of anti-Semitic abuse that some of us have been subjected to, that hope has been thwarted. The Centre for Countering Digital Hate have conducted research in this area, and they found that 9 out of 10 anti-Semitic posts on Facebook and Twitter stay there despite requests to have them removed. People like me are left with a sense of bitterness, Madam Deputy Speaker, that our suffering has to be tolerated because of some ideological, misplaced, flawed and ill-thought-out interpretation of freedom of speech.
The safest option should be the default option. That's where the point of view which we should start from. We should start from the point of view that if anybody wants to see eating disorder content, if they want to see racist content that doesn't meet the bar of illegality, if they want to see incredibly harmful content that does not meet that bar, they should have to opt in to receive that content. They shouldn't see it by default. They should have to make that actual choice.
In my view, Madam Deputy Speaker, the likelihood of a criminal prosecution will always be low. But the key difference is that in the future, tech managers, instead of waking up each day thinking only about business targets, will wake up thinking, have I done enough to protect children as I meet my business targets? And that, I'm sure we can agree, would be a very good thing.
We're committed to ensuring that children are safe online, so we'll work with these honourable members and others to bring an effective amendment in the other place which delivers our shared aims of holding people accountable for their actions in a way which is effective and targeted towards child safety, whilst ensuring the UK remains an attractive place for technology companies to invest and grow. The criminal penalties, including imprisonment and fines, will be commensurate with similar offences. Whilst this amendment will not affect those who have acted in good faith to comply in a proportionate way, it gives the Act additional teeth, as we've heard, to deliver the change that we all want and ensure that people are held to account if they fail to properly protect children.
Interesting debate. Before we go, David, what are we expecting in Parliament next week?
Another busy week, Joe. A lot of legislative heavy lifting by MPs. Keep an eye out for the Northern Ireland Budget Bill. A reminder that in the absence of an Assembly and an Executive at Stormont, MPs are having to do a lot of the stuff that would normally be done by MLAs in Belfast. Well, as you say, big issues to chew over and debate next week in Parliament. Thank you very much. Thanks to all of our correspondents. That's all for Politics UK for this week. I'll be back with Politics Live on Monday at 12:15 on BBC Two and the iPlayer. Bye-bye.